Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A series. We are here again with John Vervaeke. Thank you, John, for being here.
Pleasure.
And as I have a cough and don't want to cough into everyone's ears all night, this is Brett. I will be passing it on to our admin Andre, who will be continuing the hosting for the rest of the session. So thank you, Andre.
Hi, John, and hi, everybody. The
Hi,
first question is from Valeria, and she said she'd stay awake, hopefully, to ask it. And I see that she is here, so I will invite her to speak for this.
Hey, so just for the moderators to know, I also did not see anything inviting me here. I had to put myself up. I don't know what Discord is doing that now. Yeah. Hello, John. That's Valeria from the Circling.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. Yeah, my question is regarding the idea of relevance realization. So I had it in my mind watching the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series that relevance realization was something that happened outside of consciousness, automatically. And I always understood that sometimes you say we do relevance realization. It was meant not as something that we can actively do, but as something that the brain does or the mind does. The question is, I have heard people talking about relevance realization as something that we should do. For example, we are at our best when we actively seek relevance realization, or when we have a problem, we should do relevance realization and find the relevant aspects of it. Then I got a little bit confused if I understood it wrong or if there's something that I'm missing.
Yes, that's an excellent question. So part of it has to do with the idea that relevance realization, as I do say in the series, is something that's happening in a massively recursive manner. And part of this was developed later with the Untangling the World Knot series that I did with Greg Enriquez, about the idea that that you can distinguish, for example, between relevance realization that, as you said, is largely going on unconsciously in the brain and giving rise to salience landscaping, but there's higher order, and this is where the recursion comes in, relevance realization that's going on in consciousness. Part of the proposal is that consciousness is how information is made relevant to working memory, and that salience is the relevance that has gained high enough priority to come into online working memory. That is consciousness, in the sense of when you hold things in mind. And insofar that in working memory we can manipulate items in order to alter their salience, we can therefore have a top-down effect on the unconscious aspects of relevance realization. You know this, of course. You can be consciously aware of the words your big toe and your left big toe, and then that becomes salient to you. Now, the processing was always going on unconsciously, but you can then move it into conscious awareness. Now, the point about that is that integration, that functional integration with working memory and the ability to manipulate and reorganize information is what you're doing often, I think, when people are recommending that you sort of improve your relevance realization. You can direct your attention to integrate information in a way that, for example, is more transfer appropriate. So let me give you a clear example of this. When you are studying, you could choose to simply rehearse the material in working memory. You could just repeat it to yourself over and over again. And that is not very transfer appropriate. That will not transfer very well to the test situation. Or instead, if you knew the test was going to be in an essay format, what you could do is you could study by practicing giving yourself essay questions and writing the essay answers. And that is going to be much more transfer appropriate. So I can use working memory to chunk the information in different ways that is going to increase my chance of using that information to solve my problems, or in this particular example, pursue more long-term goals. So there is a sense in which you can recommend to people that they can use the way in which working memory manipulates salience in order to alter the unconscious relevance realization that is going on and improve your ability to achieve certain goals or solve certain types of problems.
So in that case, it would be training it for putting yourself in the situation that you are going to use the information for.
Yes, that's a particular example. That's not the only example. I just used that as one example of why, and this is part of the overall question is why did, and one of the best models of working memory, which is Lynn Hasher's model, a colleague at UFT, is that working memory is this higher order relevance realization. And so part of the question is, well, why did we evolve this higher order relevance realization? And the answer is, it seems that we evolved it in order to intervene in the relevance realization in the way I've just described when we're dealing with novel, complex, or ill-defined situations. That's what consciousness seems to be doing. So insofar as consciousness can make an impact on unconscious relevance realization, we can do all kinds of things through the global workspace that is working memory and consciousness to reconfigure how we're doing our more unconscious relevance realization. Now, that doesn't mean that conscious relevance realization is ultimately in charge. It's still ultimately dependent for its generation and its existence on the unconscious relevance realization. But there is a sense in which it can exercise some top-down effects on the bottom-up processing coming out of unconscious relevance realization.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer.
You see this even in your attention. You have bottom-up aspects that grab your attention, that's the unconscious, but you have top-down aspects in which you can direct attention.
Yeah, I guess that the question was mainly on the use of the term relevance realization. But if you said that you elaborated on that on the untangling the word knot, I have not had the chance to watch that yet. I was mainly going with the awakening from the mini crisis.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think that's a legitimate question to bring up, which is one of the reasons why I did Untangling the World Knot, and I'm working with Effie Ugian into turning this into a couple of papers on consciousness for which I'm seeking publication.
I'll make sure I'll check that out.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, next we have a question from Rachel Hayden, who says, hello, at Brett and obviously John. I have a class during the Q&A time tonight, but if there's room, please ask the following. My memory serves me, in a recent video, you mentioned some research that people with a religious path score better on some kind of wisdom assessment, regardless of their particular religion. Can you point me towards that research? I'm intensely curious. And by the way, the Lafargue book on Plato was immediately useful, and it's a method for discovering transcendent virtues measure well with my koan practice. Thanks again, sending my best, Rachel.
It's great to hear from you, Rachel. And I'm hoping we can do another video together at some point. Yeah. So I'm glad the book was helpful to you. The work is, it's by my RA and TA and collaborator, Junsun Kim. It was basically work with his MA thesis. So that is officially a publication. You could go into University of Toronto and his MA thesis, he's at OISE, and you could find it. I suggest the waiting because he is presently turning a bunch of this work into, and this is what you do in your career, he's turning a lot of this work into publishable papers that are going to come out soon. So that work has not yet been published in journals, but that is something he is currently working on. He's doing that as he's completing, I'm kind of proud to say this, he's completing his project for his PhD this year. So that's where you could find that. What I could do, Rachel, is if you email me, I could connect you to Junsung, and he could share that information with you directly.
Okay, next is a question that was from Richard. Question for John. Let's see if Richard is here first. I don't think I see him. No. Okay, well, I'll read it for him. Question for John. I'd like to communicate it myself. Well, I've been reading a book called Caring for Worlds in a Culture of Lies, which has been a very interesting read. It contains exactly the argument you would think. Modern culture has lost much of the nuances of languages once present in a cultural discourse, and we're in danger of losing the rich legacy of Western language if we do not act as conservationists for our languages. The author, Marilyn McIntyre, has one passage specifically which reminds me of your explications of words like understand, erotic, etc. She says, few Americans now take enough Latin or Greek or even modern foreign languages to have much awareness of the etymological layers of meaning that enriches the words they use. He's written this twice. She also talks about process words as a metaphor to process foods. So my question is this. I know you most likely have a very tiny idea of what McIntyre's thesis is, so I'm not asking you to critique the book by any means. However, to what extent do you believe that a cultural loss of nuance in language is contributing to the meaning crisis? Is there something to the idea that a narrowing of the experiences we can communicate causes conflict, disillusion, and other negative states?
I think that's an excellent question. So I tried to exemplify the Heideggerian approach to recovering phenomenological aspects of our terms by an etymological exploration, and then using that to try and renew our current understanding. And I think the fact that we have lost the practice of etymology, tracing things back to the Greek or the Latin or the German, for example, or the French, has contributed significantly to a loss of cognitive flexibility, the ability to reformulate the meanings we're using, to reformulate the problems we're addressing. And so I repeatedly made use of that Heideggerian strategy throughout the series. So I think it's important to engage in a practice by which we savor historical richness of the terms we use as a way of resisting the flattening of our ontology and the making rigid of our cognitive framing that is, and I think those two things are deeply contributory to the meaning crisis. It's amazing how much people are unaware of what their terms could mean for them. It's like carrying around a broadsword and keeping it permanently sheathed and using it as a club, not really realizing all of the potential that is available to you in that tool if you simply unsheathed it and looked at it more closely and realized some of its other potentials. I think this is part of a general problem we have in which I know I get criticized for this, and I do understand that there's excess on my part, so I don't want to deny that. But I know that, and Paul Vanderklay does it with affection. You know, all the fancy Vervaekean terms and all that, and people, why don't you speak more plainly? Plane is a flat surface. And sometimes that is not the correct topology, trying to understand the depths of our ontology, the depths of the problems we're facing. Precision of thought requires tremendous empowerment of our vocabulary and our cognitive grammar. And so I do think that one of the things we can do as an individual and especially as a collective practice is working on building up our conceptual vocabulary, our theoretical grammar, in a way that empowers us to see things that we couldn't see before and formulate problems we couldn't see before. Our culture drives us to speaking plainly and passionately about the bottom line. I put it to you that although there are contexts in which that is appropriate, the claim that that should be the pervasive norm by which we regulate our thought and our communication is a pernicious species of absolute bullshit that we should challenge as much as we possibly can. When I'm a martial artist, I'm not satisfied if I learn, hey, I can strike in this one way, and then I'm just going to use that over and over again. I realize that I have to have a wide repertoire of moves, some of them that are finely distinct from each other and can be articulated in both senses of the word and coordinated together. I want the same ability for my cognitive endeavors. So I'm speaking very forcefully about this because I want to resist the general cultural move to reduce us to a flat plane, a flat world ontology, because the people that are pushing that, you check, 9 times out of 10, they want to manipulate you by robbing you of the empowerment that a depth of meaning provides for you.
I think it's a great answer. I'm also not a fan of pernicious bullshit, so I think that's something we can all band together with. And I would say, yeah, that's very powerful because one of the things that the power of words does is also gives us existential identification.
Yes.
And if you want to rob someone of their identity, you rob them of being able to describe their identity to the world and to their groups. And so, say you rob a Jewish man of his Judaism and take away those terms and say you're not allowed to call yourself this, then there's this. I think there'd be a sense of self that's lost in that act of demolishing of language.
I think so. I think that's exactly analogous to how if I removed literacy from you, you would be diminished in your identity and scope in a profound way. And there's a sense in which there's a kind of cognitive literacy, if you'll allow me to play with those words a little bit, that we lose when we give in to the impulse to reduce things to the bottom line. Now, we do need to make material accessible. I'm not arguing against that, but we do need to also. I mean, this is why Heidegger is hard to read. But we do also need to be willing to follow people who are creating the vocabulary and the grammar that will take us out of our habitual framing of things. That will not be easy because we are breaking out of our habitual framing. We should not be using ease of understanding as our sole measure of depth of understanding.
I agree with that. And it's almost like there needs to be a phenomenological reduction done on language itself.
Yes.
So next we have Velasquez who wants to ask you a question.
Please. Velasquez.
Hello. So I've been thinking, as usual, about the four Ps, and I was just wondering, have you ever had an explicit thought or theory about them being embedded within one another? Because I considered that, like say the skill of tennis, procedural
Mhm.
knowing, you would definitely like an integral part of that skill would be taking perspectives on the pitch and the ball and the position of your body and so on.
Yeah, I do have an explicit theory of ontological relation. That's different from how they might show up phenomenologically or how they might show up pedagogically. Ontologically, I would make exactly the argument you would do, and I would continue it. I would say that my procedural knowledge depends, as you said, on my perspectival situational awareness. My my situational awareness depends on my ability to make various affordances salient to me. And that, of course, raises the question, what's generating those affordances, like the graspability of the tennis racket, and the hitability of the ball, all of these things. What is generating all those affordances? And that's the participatory knowing. That's the way in which biology and culture and your online consciousness are co-shaping you and the world into an agent arena relationship that opens up a network of affordances. So the participatory knowing generates affordances. The perspectival knowing makes many of those affordances salient to you within a situation. That's exactly what a situation is. It's a bunch of affordances that have been made co-salient together and thereby relevant to you. And then that situational awareness tells you which skills you need to activate and or acquire. Then only once you're interacting with the world via those skills and generating causal relationships, do you obtain the evidence that alters your beliefs that are at the core of your propositional knowing.
Yeah, I remember that the hierarchy, but do you think like would you think that basically any kind of knowing could in principle be embedded in any other? So say, well, yeah, your participatory knowing changes based on the skills that you have. So you'll see different affordances in the environment based on what, not just on what's there, but based on what you're able to do.
Oh, I see. I think you're using the word embedding differently than I would. So I'm trying to. I see. Um, so am I understanding you in saying? Do I think that, for example, the skill, my procedural skills could have an impact on my participatory knowing or something like that? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, or vice versa. So
Yeah, very much. So that's what I meant when I was trying to distinguish between the ontological order, the hierarchy, as you put it, of emergence, and other potential ways in which they could be related together. I think if we're talking about the causal interaction, the causal interactions between them are flowing up and down in various ways. Yeah, very much. That your procedures can alter your participatory knowing, because your skills, of course, open up changes in your body and how your body can conform to the world, and that creates the possibility of new affordances. When I know how to swim, right, crossing the lake becomes an affordance for me in a way it wasn't when I couldn't swim, and things like that. Yes, very much.
cool. Thank you.
But Velasquez, it's very important, I would argue, to keep clear about the kind of relations we're trying to specify between the four Ps. Is it an ontological? Is it a pedagogical? Is it a causal? Right? And the causal relations, for example, since they tend to be emphasized when you're trying to train certain things, that's going to make you see the relationship between four kinds of knowing different than if you're trying to ask the question, how did they emerge ontogenetically or phylogenetically?
Mm.
As a scientist, I'm most concerned with that emergence question of ontogenetic and phylogenetic emergence. So because for me, I want to ultimately understand, in a proper sense, the nature of meaning, not just how to train it or how to teach it or how to transform it. I do want to answer those questions, But as a scientist, I want to answer the nature question primarily and first.
Thank you.
That was a good question. Sorry I misunderstood you at first.
It's no problem. It's an understandable misunderstanding.
Well, those are the best kind.
Would you be able to clarify what the terms ontogenetic and phylogenetic mean?
So ontogenetic means the development within an individual, sort of, if a bit of oversimplification, baby to adult. Phylogenetic has to do with how it has emerged within evolutionary history across species. So how did bipedalism emerge, for example? Notice I can ask that question. I can ask it in two ways. I can ask, how does bipedalism emerge in a child? And I will give you one particular kind of answer. And then I want to ask, I can ask the question, how did bipedalism, that's ontogenetic, how did bipedalism emerge in our species? That's phylogenetic. And then if I can give answers to both of those, that's good. But you know what's best? If I can give an answer to both of those in an integrated fashion. Why the phylogenetic answer helps me to answer the ontogenetic question.
Yeah, that makes sense. I thought I knew ontogenetic, but I thought I would just clarify it for everyone. Anyway, so the next question we have is from Miana, and I don't see her in the audience either, so I'll ask it for her. She says, what defines a community? How does the community prevent the individual from being overpowered by the ego? And how does it avoid being overpowered by the ego itself? This seems to be possible even with an ecology of practices.
Yeah, so this was one of the great themes of Tillich, individuation, participation tension. He argued that there is no final solution to that problem, that we're in a perpetual trade-off. What we're always seeking is an ongoing, evolving, optimal grip about that. And I think I'm in deep agreement with Tillich about that, which is why I resist trying to ultimately capture the relationship between the individual and community in any kind of final political vision, because I do not think that such a thing will ever capture the always dynamic relationship between individuation and participation. And so I suppose the way I try to understand, or I try to address that, is by getting everybody to participate both individually and collectively as much as possible in improving optimal gripping, both individually and collectively. The hope is that if we have individuals cultivating wisdom within a common unity, that's what community means, a common unity of distributed cognition that is seeking to exact collective intelligence into collective wisdom, that the two will pay off against each other in a self-organizing fashion. So I'm hoping for this possibility that the way democracy used to work and science used to work, and perhaps they still do work when they're working properly, is that we can be people in common unity about the process, not so much about the product or the particular content. What I mean by that is, instead of trying to be about a particular ego's, or instead of trying to prevent, that's the wrong word, I misspoke. Instead of trying to prevent certain people, dominating, in some sort of populist fashion, or the group, group thinking and dominating the individuals, I hope that what we could do is get something like what is possible in individuals. Spinoza argued this about scientia intuitiva, in which there's a smooth flowing, self-organizing, bottom-up individual wisdom and a smooth flowing top down from collective wisdom, and they're mutually correcting and balancing each other and helping to coordinate both individual and group ecologies of practices so they function more smoothly. Now that sounds very promissory, but I point to you this. We keep trying to replace that cultural process of self-organization with stipulated political processes and stultifying structures, and finding that that's ultimately a mistake. So one example of where this clearly works is and it goes back to a previous discussion, we all add individually to our vocabulary, and we are also influenced by the vocabulary of our community. We all have a common unity, for example, of speaking English here. And we don't have to have a watchguard for that. We can have people making recommendations and arguments like I did earlier, but nobody has to manage English language in that fashion. Are there individuals that rise up and become influencers? Yeah, but they're also constrained by all the individual idiolects and individual vocabularies that people have. So there's this ongoing organic exchange between them. It seems to me if we can do something with that with our medium of propositional cognition and communication, we should be able to do something analogous to that. There are other forms of cognition and communication. That is at least the hope I'm proposing.
I'm not sure I actually understood most of that. I'm gonna have to go back and revisit. But I think that was a great answer.
Thank you.
So next is a question from Pat. He says, "I have a question for John." And first is Pat here. Let's see, is he in the audience? No. So, hi John, I love your work. So I have a clarification question on how you're using the word intelligibility. Is intelligibility synonymous with the form eidos, in that it includes both the structural organization that makes something be what it is, and which it makes it knowable, or is it only referring to that feature of form that makes it knowable? In other words, does intelligibility encompass the relation and the relator, or does it only refer to the relation that makes it the relator accessible? Also, I like your phrase, the thing beyond itself. Is intelligible beyond itself the ineffable?
Oh, that's wonderful. I think I understand the question correctly. I'm understanding it as, when I'm using intelligibility as, am I talking about the structural functional organization that makes the thing be what it is, or makes it knowable, or both? And my answer is both. I mean intelligibility to be that about reality that makes knowledge of it possible. I take it that there are real structural functional organization. There are real patterns. This is why I argue against nominalism and point to other people that argue against nominalism. There are real patterns, and those real patterns really afford cognitive agents in knowing those real patterns. So that I mean by intelligibility, that whole thing. I mean both structural functional organization and reality, real relationship of the affordance of knowability, and when that is actualized in our knowing of it. Now, is the ineffable the thing beyond itself of intelligibility, or the thing beyond itselfness, I guess, of intelligibility? Yes, I think that intelligibility is bidirectional, both ontologically and epistemically, and this is part of a deeper conformity theory, in that the intelligibility of things is always phenomena, how they're shining into our knowledge and understanding, but also the ongoing real potential for them to afford more knowing, which is how they withdraw into the mystery of their moreness, and why they are inexhaustible in their ability to generate more intelligibility for us. So in that sense, I think the way intelligibility is a thing beyond itself is pointing, when we're talking about that, we're talking about how it is do I want to say yes, necessarily, if the phenomenological argument is right, it's a necessity. Intelligibility is necessarily bound up, constitutively, that's what I want to say, bound up with ineffability. This is one of the great claims made by the Neoplatonic and Christian Neoplatonic traditions, and you can see analogous arguments, I think, being made within various strands of Buddhism, also Taoism. The way that can be spoken of is not the way, but nevertheless, the way is the mother of all things, the myriad of all things. That source of ineffability is simultaneously one, not logically one, but one with the presencing of current intelligibility. So yeah, I do think that it's important to. This is why I'm doing work with Dan Chiappy on this and going through John Rusin. And I had the great pleasure of knowing that John Rusin is going to come to the University of Toronto in February for a conference, hopefully COVID willing, and it should be. We need to do, and we need to keep doing, a careful phenomenology of intelligibility, both in terms of its experiential dimensions and in terms of its ontological dimensions. How this takes us beyond what's sayable. Intelligibility draws us, ecstasis, draws us beyond what is sayable as we pursue question. The fundamental question of Greek epistemology is not how can I know in the sense of what's going on inside my mind. What Gerson argues, I think, beautifully is the fundamental question is, what must reality be like such that it is knowable by me in the way that I find it knowable? I think I'm trying as much as I can to reorient my project of understanding the phenomenology of intelligibility in that ancient fashion. So I hope that answers that question. I think it's a really important question, and it really cuts to the core of a lot of the work I'm doing right now.
It's a fascinating answer, but the way you describe that, is that somewhat similar to like it being an analogy of Heidegger's metaphysical question in Intro to Metaphysics, where saying to investigate ontology, we have to ask a question like, what does it mean to be a being rather than nothing? And then he investigates, well, what is a question? And then he talks about we have to know what a question comes from. He's talking about it like Umspring. So that would be like knowing what the world is around us. What must reality be like to investigate wisdom?
Very much. Yeah. Sorry, I think I interrupted you, Andre. Sorry.
No, I'm glad you did.
Heidegger is very much, I mean, his project is explicitly trying to get back right to that ancient Greek framework and integrate it with the phenomenological framework of Husserl to re-ask these questions, not like, what I mean by re-asking is to not ask the same questions we've always been asking since Descartes when we're trying to do epistemology, but try to ask them in a fundamentally different way. And I've been trying recently to get at this integration of a return, right, to the more ancient orientation of epistemology, the Platonic, and integrate it with phenomenology in a way, yes, inspired by Heidegger, but different from Heidegger. And I've been doing this in these videos around what I call eidetic induction and how it's bound up with dialogos. Because I'm trying to get, I'm trying to get at the same, I think, the same goal that Heidegger was at. I'm trying to bring a different set of practices and psychotechnologies to bear upon that problem.
that would make sense quite a lot. So you're not so much tearing down previous phenomenology as he was trying to do, but you're trying to create an alternate one in that sense, in the Heideggerian creation.
Yes, very much. That's a good way of putting it. And I think this I mean, this sounds also, very sort of, esoteric and who cares. But if we go back to we were talking about a few minutes ago in when I was answering the original question, right? These practices of eidetic induction and dialectic into dialogos are about trying to renew our intimacy of contact and conformity with intelligibility. And if we do not do that, we will not be able to get to the rudiments of what's gone wrong in our meaning-making machinery. And if we don't get to those rudiments, we won't be able to bring about the kinds of radical transformations we need in order to address a meaning crisis that is getting worse fairly rapidly, and bringing with it an important kind, bringing with it an increase in an important kind of urgency that I'm finding quite telling. The COVID was very much an accelerant and a bifurcator around the meaning crisis, and it also brought things home, both in the sense of, we all experienced an increase in domicile, but I think we all have seen people confronting issues of meaning in ways they hadn't before, and doing that often in a confused and fragmented fashion, relationships breaking, careers self-terminating, people not wanting to go back to their careers and the real world after COVID. A lot of this is pointing out that things seem to be speeding up. And you have to go deeper, faster, in order to try and ahead of the curve, I think. I don't mean to sound ominous, but the number of respectable, and I mean scientifically, intellectually, respectable authors who are talking now seriously about collapse, and I don't mean political collapse, they mean like civilizational collapse, like analogous to the Bronze Age collapse. That number has gone up significantly in the last 5 years, and I think we need to consider that there might be some real probability and plausibility to that. We need to respond accordingly. Sorry, I don't mean to be saying that this community is not doing that. Of course they are. I'm trying to indicate why what appears to be some very abstract, purely philosophical things is actually trying to do what Socrates and Plato were doing, which is give people the tools to deal with a turning point in cultural history.
Yeah, I agree with that quite strongly. I actually wrote a piece on this last year. We'll move on to the next question, though, which is from Rob Randolph, who says, "You're talking about Ensof, as I understand it. This is where existence and non-existence participate in the same wholeness that contains possibilities. I have a contemplative practice in which I attempt to accept the total impossibility of grasping anything. It's not a be, it's a process, a becoming." And that tells all the questions. So I'm not sure whether he's serious.
Yeah, I'm not. That didn't sound like a question. I mean, I think there are many of those practices in which we move to what Gregory of Nyssa called epictasis, where we stop trying to get what's called cognitive closure. We stop trying to close or conclude or confirm. Listen to all this language, and instead we realize an unending trajectory of transframing. And it's interesting that Gregory of Nyssa proposed that. It was very radical. I think it was almost considered heretical, but he proposed that as an alternative way of thinking about blessedness of paradise, not as a final resting place, but to think of God as a field in which we are perpetually self-transcending, but upon which we can never find any conclusion or closure. And I think that's exactly right. And I think engaging in those practices, you get something similar, of course, in the cloud of unknowing. You get the same thing in Nicholas of Cusa's Learned Ignorance. I think all of those practices are very important and they're prevalent. For me, it's really like sort of important right now historically as I'm working on After Socrates is the way Socrates' proposal that his wisdom consisted in him knowing that he did not know goes through basically 1,500 years of development until it reached, no, sorry, that was exactly wrong, 1,800 years of development until we reach Nicholas of Cusa, who basically, after this entire Socratic, Platonic, Neoplatonic, Christian Neoplatonic tradition, proposes learned ignorance as the highest state by which we can come into right relationship to reality. And I find that such a powerful and complex process of explication and articulation that it's hard to see that kind of grand circle anywhere else in our intellectual development. And so to me, that in of itself as a historical fact is impressive. It's having an impact on my reflection about all of this.
Okay, next we have Strawn, who wants to ask you a question.
So Andre, hi Strawn, I'll take
Yep.
your question, but this will have to be the last one because we're passing 7:30. And I
right.
I do need to get going.
This is but it's time.
But I do want to hear Strawn, please.
Yeah, I'll try and make this brief, although it's a difficult question. Yeah, okay, so I'll just read it out then. This is something of a story of two paradises. To paraphrase, you more or less describe paradise as people feasting on the all-you-can-eat food for thought buffet that you prepared for public consumption. But in keeping with this metaphor, I'm somewhat hesitant to bite too close to the bone. By contrast, Jordan Peterson defined paradise rather technically as a walled garden, and he specifically described the garden aspect in terms of a creative chaos, to which I would personally add that this means that the walls must signify intelligible order, because then paradise serves as an apt symbol for self-organizing criticality, and of course self-organizing criticality is all about standing on the border of order and chaos. With this in mind, my question to you is, what is chaos? When you described moreness, you said that it wasn't chaotic. Does this mean that the chaos is to be found in suchness? My concern is that because you seem to articulate moreness and suchness in terms of intelligibility, that there is no room for chaos, and by extension it becomes unclear how your account of moreness and suchness is meant to interface with self-organizing criticality. And while I'm hesitant to pick at this because I'm very leery of poking too harshly at what people find sacred, I nevertheless think this points to a non-trivial problem.
I agree.
The thing is, it seems...
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, okay. I'm almost finished. The thing is, it seems rather obvious to me that the creative chaos is agapic and that by contrast the intelligible order is logoic, and that we look to the walls to get our ises and the garden for our oughts. You said previously that you were not as familiar with agape as you were with logos, but I would dispute this. Despite what your head may protest and how it may invoke intelligibility, I propose to you that your heart gave the game away when you introduced your former student with a parent's pride. Pedagogy is but agape put into practice. And while an all-you-can-eat food for thought buffet might sound like an inexhaustible font of intelligibility, I put it to you that the character of your paradise is that of a teacher reveling in the fruits of his agapic labors.
That was very poetic, Struan.
Yeah, it was either going to be poignant or cringy, so I feel like the format.
I took it as poignant. I wasn't cringy. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. This is a non-trivial problem. So the difficulty that I've had with when I've talked with Jordan about order and chaos is exactly the question you've posed to me. Because I would put it to you that if you were to ask Jordan what that is, I don't think you would get a clear answer. Precisely because it's hard to distinguish chaos, which is completely non-intelligible, and that's problematic because then the ineffability of the non-intelligible, the ineffability of that which is deprived of intelligibility becomes hard to distinguish, especially phenomenologically. The ineffability of that which is superlative, which is a superordinate source of intelligibility. This, of course, is one of the deep problems within Neoplatonism. How do you ultimately distinguish matter from the one? That they both fall outside of intelligible content. One is somehow deprived of intelligibility. The one is somehow is a superordinate source of it. And the problem I have then I wouldn't say, for example, that criticality is the same thing as, let me be careful. Criticality is the reduction in mutual predictability, which is the reduction in order. And the point I think you're making is that reduction in order can be understood as chaos. But of course, you're not invoking it as a chaos that can in any way exist in its own right. It only exists insofar as it's a relationship to the system of which it is critical. So you can't have sort of criticality on its own. I'm trying to be fair to what you're saying, so you can hear me wrestling with it as I'm speaking to you. I suppose that I ultimately think that there isn't absolute chaos. And in that sense, like Plotinus, in Plotinus's sense of matter, in that I think we're ultimately talking about non-being. The thing that's, although I'm wrestling with this, the thing that's challenging for me with respect to Jordan is Jordan sometimes talks as if chaos is a force at work in the world, sometimes talks about it as if it's non-being and therefore is more like a tear or a hole in being. Then sometimes he talks about it as possibility, and possibility is neither non-being nor a force. So I don't want to I don't want to do any of those. I want to try and understand how it is that there's real possibility that really affords a system transcending itself. I think that criticality, for example, is not chaotic in a deep sense because we can describe, and we do describe criticality and self-organizing criticality with power laws. There is a law-like structure that makes the science of self-organizing criticality possible. And so that's why I'm hesitant to identifying it with chaos. I think instead it represents real possibility acting as a real alteration of what is possible for the actual series of events that's unfolding. I'm not happy, as I said, of equating chaos with possibility or chaos with non-being. So I don't know. I guess the reason I don't speak about it very much is because, as you can see, I can't properly articulate to myself, and that could just be a failure of education or imagination on my part of how to speak about chaos.
Well,
now, go ahead.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think that the thing for me, if I understand Plato correctly, is that his argument regarding chaos was precisely that it was unintelligible to him, and that's what made it chaos. So I mean, well, I would think that if you follow in the tradition of Plato, then you're gonna have problems of trying to figure out what chaos is, because it's entirely contrary to the project of knowledge.
Yeah, it goes against one of Plato's deepest influences is Parmenides, right? That intelligibility and being have some kind of non-logical identity relationship, and then we've been spending 2 millennia trying to figure out what those are, and that's been sort of running through a lot of the questions here. And so I like what Whitehead is trying to do when he's trying to invoke creativity as something other than order by invoking novelty as an important dimension that's not properly covered by order per se, and that creativity is important to intelligibility. I think, and the way that Whitehead sort of sets the Neoplatonic ontology in motion. And I would be happy, sorry, that's too strong. I would be happier considering, as Whitehead does, a relationship between sort of order and creativity, because I do think there is something about novelty that is irreducible to atemporal order. And that is also part of what Plato was wrestling with, as you know. As he was wrestling with issues around time and what was the relationship of time to both becoming and to the eternity of being. And so that, I think, that is something very fruitful with exploring.
Yeah, well, just really quickly, personally, I would put because you said that chaos is sometimes identified with non-being, but non-being could just be becoming. And so I think that there's a lot of fruitful possibility there in terms of looking at creativity and becoming, and then intelligibility and being.
And it is, and I agree with you, because I was going to lead into the thought, if we find with Whitehead an ontological grounding of creativity, I think we get something that does integrate the logos with agape, because I think one of the defining features of agape is its creative dimension.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I kind of indicated in the question itself, I would agree with that pretty much, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that's well, that's the piece that I'm trying to make sure doesn't get lost in the whole worldview that's being painted here.
Yeah, and that's right, and that's why I keep going back almost on a daily basis to Christian Platonism as my historical fount from which I'm trying to understand in depth and in practice the integration of agape and logos together, and doing that while not being a Christian is a very interesting project existentially and phenomenologically.
Yeah, okay, there's just one weird thought that I had that I could drop a penny here and maybe it'll help, but the thing that occurred to me in myth is that the ultimate wish is for the genie to be free. And that's, why is it that we wish for the genie to be free? And that's just something I think that maybe we're trying to tell ourselves in myth. And yeah.
It's interesting, especially given all of the mythology around how that's always a very bad idea. Yeah, that's very
really?
good.
Which mythology speaks about wishing for the genie to be free?
So there's a broad recommendation within sort of Arabic proverbial mythology that letting the jinn out of the bottle, this is why we have the phrase letting the genie out of the bottle, is a bad idea, because the jinn is very often going to take revenge on you, either directly or in a manipulative fashion, because it has been imprisoned so long.
Huh. Okay, yeah, well, I mean, maybe Aladdin isn't the best example to go by then. Thanks for that. I'll have to look into that. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, John, for these great answers as always. And thank you, Andre, for filling in for me as a mill. I really appreciate that. You did a great job. And thank you to everyone for the great questions. And sorry we had some technical difficulties. We didn't get to a few of them. So we will catch up next time. So thanks again, everybody. This has been great.
Thank you so much, everybody. Take good care and have a good night.
Thanks, John.